This is Reading the Times for Wednesday, February 5th, 2020. Trump claims end of American decline while avoiding mention of impeachment. President Trump claimed credit for a great American comeback in a speech to Congress on Tuesday night, boasting of a robust economy, contrasting his successes with the records of his predecessors and projecting optimism in the face of a months-long Democratic effort to force him from office. At the same time, Mr. Trump used the speech as a clarion call to his most conservative supporters, prompting some Republicans in the chamber to chant, "4 more years." The president also boasted that he was building a long, tall, and very powerful wall across the southwestern border and vowed to oppose what he called a socialist takeover of the healthcare system by Democrats in Washington and those running to replace him in the White House. At another point, the president singled out Juan Guaido, the leader of Venezuela's opposition movement, who received his most visible show of support yet from Mr. Trump, a seat in the president's guest box for the State of the Union. Assured of acquittal, Trump makes case for a second term. President Trump never uttered the word impeachment, but in a 78-minute speech to the nation that combined a celebration of the American economy, hard-edge policy pronouncements, and reality show-style surprises for the audience, he made the case for his presidency as only he could. A fractious, divisive, and chaotic process inevitably takes focus away from Trump's own failures, at least in the short term, and Trump obviously believes he has the opportunity to stir the pot against the Democrats in these circumstances, said Geoff Garin, a prominent Democratic pollster. Rather than wait, the president then had Melania Trump pull the medal out and drape it around Mr. Limbaugh's neck right there in the First Lady's box. Surely the first time that has happened at a State of the Union address. Iowa Democrats released partial caucus results, but no winner yet. The top Democratic presidential candidates sparred on Tuesday with leaders of the Iowa Democratic Party, and at times with one another in a strenuous effort to shape the terms and timing of the release of results from the presidential caucuses here. On a midday conference call and in other private conversations with Iowa Party leaders, representatives for Mr. Sanders, former Mayor Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana, and Senators Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts and Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota urged local officials to provide the most complete set of results possible, and several campaign emissaries pushed for access to the paper trail that the party was using to verify returns from the caucuses. If you put out 50% of the results, people are going to take that as final, Jesse Harris, a Biden advisor in Iowa, said of the conference call with the party. A system-wide disaster, how the Iowa caucuses melted down. So last Thursday, Mr. Bagniewski, the chairman of the Democratic Party in Polk County, Iowa's most populous, decided to scrap the app entirely, instructing his precinct chairs to simply call in the caucus results as they had always done. Mr. Dept, who had filed shortly after 8 p.m., said he had received a call from the state party almost 3 hours later asking for the results he had long since filed. Mr. Price issued a statement saying that he planned to release the results later on Tuesday and that the delay was because the integrity of our process and the results have and always will be our top priority. Coronavirus crisis shows China's governance failure. Under the high-pressure environment of anti-corruption campaign, most people, including senior government officials, only care about self-preservation. Mr. Xu said, local officials don't seem to have local people at the top of their list of priorities. Even outside the hardest hit areas, local officials are showing that they don't make rules with the well-being of the people in mind. Faulty Iowa app was part of push to restore Democrats' digital edge. The faulty smartphone app behind the chaotic aftermath of Iowa's Democratic caucuses was the work of a little-known company called Shadow Incorporated, which was founded by veterans of Hillary Clinton's unsuccessful presidential campaign, and whose previous work was marked by a string of failures, including a near bankruptcy. Iowa's Democrats blame a coding issue in the app, and the party said it would resort to a time-consuming manual tally based on information called in by precinct chairs or pictures sent on their smartphones, the same ones on which they could not make the app work. Shadow, in a tweet, said, We sincerely regret the delay in the reporting of the results last night's Iowa caucuses and the uncertainty it has caused. But the company offered no explanation for what went wrong, though Democratic officials said that the data had been incorrectly transmitted from the app to a central database and that many users had been unable to follow the complicated process for installing the app on their phones. For Lebanon Shiites, a dilemma: stay loyal to Hezbollah or keep protesting. As Lebanon hobbles into its fifth month of political and economic meltdown, the countrywide protests continue to include protesters of all religious backgrounds, uniting in scorn for leaders who cannot offer even the basics: 24-hour electricity, a functional economy, or trustworthy governance. Though the parties have not openly encouraged the attacks, the men have shouted party slogans or simply Shia! 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 in interviews in majority Shiite areas. Protesters reported receiving threatening calls, anonymous WhatsApp audio notes warning of a negative impact on your life, or visits from Hezbollah or Amal representatives asking them to stop protesting. Jad Jarjoui, 20, a protester in Tyre, who volunteered with Hezbollah in Syria for a few months and is now unemployed, said that he kept protesting despite his family's opposition and a visit from a local Hezbollah leader. Mumbai police play a trick on honking drivers. On every side is a thickening stew of bicycle rickshaws, little taxis, fat Mercedes, Uber drivers riveted to their screens, drivers drifting in and out of lanes, and Mario Andretti types hurtling down the main drag 6 inches from each other. Honking in traffic has become such a problem, creating so much noise that the Mumbai police hatched a plan, according to an old saying in India: to drive well, all you need are 4 simple things: a good car, good eyes, good luck, and a good horn. Defense Minister was on the line asking for millions to aid France. Or was he? Impersonating Mr. Le Drian and his aides in emails, faxes, and phone calls. In the video calls, a silicone mask of his face was worn. The scammers targeted a remarkable array of people and institutions: French embassies abroad and foreign embassies in France, aid groups and charities, foreign governments, the chief executive of large companies like Total or Pernod Ricard, the archbishops of Lyon and Paris, and Nicolas Hulot, a well-known French environmentalist. To reassure the targets, the scammers sometimes went as far as to schedule fake appointments with Mr. Le Drian at the French Parliament, or to send fake documents from France's central bank purporting to show that the money was being reimbursed. Delphine Mediot, a lawyer representing Mr. Lebanon, said on Tuesday in an interview with France Interradio that the scammers were preying upon the targets at a time when fears about terrorism were particularly acute after a string of deadly attacks in France and the rise of terrorist groups profiting from the war in Syria. Judge who pushed graft cases against ex-president of Argentina dies. Judge Bonadio, who had worked on cases against Miss Kirchner and people close to her with unusual zeal, and it was uncertain whether many of his cases would be pursued at a time when her political power is on the rise. Judge Bonadio had worked on cases against Mrs. Kirchner and people close to her with unusual zeal, and it was uncertain whether many of his cases would be pursued at a time when her political power is on the rise. In her 2019 memoir, Sincerely, Mrs. Kirchner called Judge Bonadio the hitman. Months before stepping down from the presidency, Mrs. Kirchner characterized the judge as an extortionist and said he was part of the mafia. Any mafia. Several of the cases Judge Bonadio filed against Mrs. Kirchner had advanced unusually fast. South African court issues warrant for Jacob Zuma's arrest. A judge in South Africa issued an arrest warrant on Tuesday for Jacob Zuma, the former president, for failing to appear in court on a corruption case that he had sought to avoid for months, most recently by asserting that he is ill. One of the prosecutors, Billy Downer, told the Pietermaritzburg High Court that Mr. Zuma's legal team had said the former president would be out of the country for treatment until mid-March, local news media reported. According to Mr. Zuma's team, he had 2 operations early January before going abroad, but the judge questioned a letter from a military hospital in the administrative capital, Pretoria, explaining Mr. Zuma's absence, noting that it had no date. Nigeria blindsided by Trump travel ban, its top diplomat said. Jeffrey Onyema, Nigeria's foreign minister, said that his government was already working to address security concerns that Trump administration officials said had prompted the decision announced last week to reject visas for Nigerians seeking to emigrate to the United States. In 2018, the latest data available, the State Department issued more than 7,920 immigration visas for people from Nigeria, Africa's most populous country. Mr. Pompeo called Nigeria the United States' second largest trading partner in Africa and said American companies had helped create more than 18,000 jobs in the country. Hong Kong reports its first coronavirus death as outbreak widens. The money primarily is intended for poor countries with weak public health systems and regular arrivals of passengers from China. Many African countries fall under the heading because more than 1 million Chinese expatriates work on the continent and thousands of African students are studying in China. The death of a 39-year-old man in Hong Kong was only the second reported outside mainland China after the death in the Philippines of a man from Wuhan, a city in China's central Hubei province, where the outbreak began. More of the patients who have died in mainland China, more than 80% were older than 60, and more than 75% had an underlying health condition which put them at greater risk. Jiao Yuhui, an official with China's Health Commission, said on Tuesday. $9 cabbages, emergency pork, coronavirus test, China on food. Along the roadside leading to the small eastern city of Shaoguang, workers in hazmat suits stop cars and take passengers' temperatures. Wang Shigang, a manager at one of Shaoguang's main wholesale produce markets, said that as long as the virus was kept away and the city could keep shipments moving, China's vegetable supply should remain ample. At first glance, Shaoguang, a nondescript city of 1.1 million people, does not look like an indispensable node in China's economy. but it is. Even without symptoms, Wuhan coronavirus may spread, experts fear. Health officials reported their findings last week to the Early Warnings and Response System of the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control. Ms. Deegan said their criticism was first reported by Science magazine. We have been getting reports from highly reliable people in China, scientists, investigators, and public health people who we've known over the years. And they've been telling us there's a symptomatic disease for sure, and we are seeing a symptomatic transmission, Dr. Fauci said. Dr. Maria Van Kerkhove, acting head of emergency diseases at the World Health Organization, said Tuesday that the organization had been aware of reports of individuals who might have transmitted the Wuhan coronavirus before the symptoms appeared or very soon after being infected. Giving the gift of mobility in a city locked down by coronavirus. Mr. Zhang, who wears a powder blue protective suit, face mask, and goggles when driving, is not permitted to transport residents suspected of having the coronavirus. To ward off the virus, Mr. Zhang and other drivers say they shower when they go home, as well as disinfect their protective gear and car every day. Channeling the spirit of taxi drivers worldwide, Mr. Zhang has no shortage of commentary on what the government could do better. Spreading along with the coronavirus, confusion. With the State Department issuing a do not travel advisory and a declaration by the World Health Organization of a global health emergency, the guidance to avoid mainland China is clear enough. Her group trip was to start in Ho Chi Minh City, fly on Air China from Washington with a stopover in Beijing. We had no idea. We should just cancel the trip, wait this out, or what? Said Donna Roberts, whose son is scheduled to travel to China in June on a school trip. Fear and takeout. 14 days in coronavirus. Self-quarantine. As United States officials impose new restrictions on travelers from China, many people who have returned to the country in recent days have hunkered down in their homes to make sure they were not carrying or spreading the disease. In Texas, where Joint Base San Antonio was preparing for the possibility it would house quarantined travelers from China, military leaders scheduled a town hall meeting on Wednesday to answer community concerns about safety. Starting Sunday evening, most people from other countries who have recently been in China were not being allowed into the United States, and Americans who had come from China were being asked to isolate themselves for 2 weeks. Suspected coronavirus case in New York is ruled out. A woman hospitalized in New York City amid concerns she could have the new coronavirus has been tested negative, city health officials said on Tuesday. There has yet to be a confirmed case of the new illness in New York City or anywhere in New York State. New York City officials have said that 3 patients who with samples were sent to the CDC have all traveled recently to China but had a fever, cough, shortness of breath, had tested negative for influenza, and a number of other common illnesses. There's no place like Kangaroo Island. Can it survive Australia's fires, though? The people of Kangaroo Island, which sit off of Australia's southern coast, are circumspect about their troubles. Unfortunately, if it's not extinct, it's close to it, said Bill Dunlop, the manager of Kangaroo Island Wildlife Park. 30 to 40% of the island's kangaroos are believed to have died, as well as a third of its 50,000 koalas. Evo Morales, now in exile, to run for Bolivia's Senate. Evo Morales, the former Bolivian president who fled his country in November amid violent protests over his bid to stay in power, will attempt to run for the Senate in the country's upcoming elections. Mr. Morales, Bolivia's first indigenous president, was in power for 14 years, but fled after his attempt to win a 4th term resulted in a disputed election and violent protests. The election is shaping into a battle between the competing visions of Mr. Morales and Ms. Añez for the country's political identity. Gandhi's killer evokes admiration as never before. Ramachandra Guha, a preeminent biographer of Gandhi, said fans of Gandhi's killer were no longer a fringe group. The growing cult around Mr. Godse seems to be rooted in the same militant brand of Hindu nationalism that inspired Gandhi's killer to shoot him on a mildly cold January evening in 1948. That day, Gandhi walked slowly across a stately lawn in New Delhi, India's capital, leaning on the shoulders of two young women. Mr. Godse believed Gandhi had betrayed Hindus by being too conciliatory to Muslims and by allowing Pakistan to break off during the partition of India in 1947. Pets are just property, so owners can't do much when vets harm them. After a customer complained in 1987 that Dr. Kohler had hurt her cat's legs by handling it roughly, Dr. Kohler filed a defamation lawsuit against the customer and several others who had criticized him. 2 years later, in 2008, it suspended Dr. Kohler's license, in part citing his history of illegal drug use, and then revoked it in 2010. Dr. Kohler continued to manage veterinary facilities, though he did not act as a veterinarian, and in 2015, he was able to get his license reinstated. Dr. Kohler has pleaded not guilty and remains in good standing with the veterinarian board. Democrats counter Trump on healthcare and condemn his conduct. Democrats criticized President Trump on Tuesday for seeking to repeal a landmark healthcare law and presiding over an economy they argue has left working people struggling, in a pair of official responses to his State of the Union address that also issued a searing indictment of his conduct and language, thrust into the national spotlight as a direct rebuttal to the president's speech. The two women represent the core of who Democrats are hoping to appeal to in the 2020 election, voters in the industrial Midwest, as well as voters of color who have been the most affected by the administration's policies and the president's words towards migrants. Trump and Pelosi exchanged snubs at the State of the Union address. President Trump declined to shake the hand of Speaker Nancy Pelosi before a State of the Union address. The mutual snubbing began the moment Mr. Trump walked into the House chamber and continued until he finished speaking. When Ms. Pelosi stood, an expression of vague disgust on her face, and tore up her printed copy of his speech in full view of television cameras, while Mr. Trump had his back turned. The relationship between Ms. Pelosi and Mr. Trump has long been one of the most closely watched in Washington, and it began going downhill even before Ms. Pelosi became a speaker. Trump says he is in for debates and wants to honor Rush Limbaugh. On Tuesday evening, during his address, Mr. Trump did just that, with the First Lady, Melania Trump, presenting a medal to a surprised Mr. Limbaugh in the gallery. In a jovial mood after Iowa Democrats botched Monday's caucus vote count, a situation that Mr. Trump happily called a fiasco, the president held court for nearly 2 hours on Tuesday afternoon over a lunch of soul and soup in the state dining room. The president had tough words for John Bolton, his former national security advisor, complaining that Mr. Bolton wanted to be referred to as ambassador, and saying that Mr. Bolton turned on me by writing a book that includes unflattering portrayals of Mr. Trump's behavior. Trump promotes low unemployment and rising wages in State of the Union. Under Mr. Trump, the current economic expansion has reached its 11th year, a record for the modern era of economic statistics in the United States. Primary metals manufacturing, which includes the steel and aluminum industries that Mr. Trump claimed to have restored with tariffs, shed 12,000 jobs in 2019. Unemployment growth in manufacturing, which Mr. Trump touted in his speech last year, slowed to less than 50,000 jobs in 2019, the worst rate of his presidency and the second worst of the long recovery from recession. Across Mr. Trump's 3 years in office, growth has never reached the 3% the administration forecasters have projected. Rush Limbaugh awarded Presidential Medal of Freedom at the State of the Union. During his State of the Union speech, President Trump awarded the conservative radio host Rush Limburger the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Mr. Limburger, 69, sat next to the First Lady, Melania, at the gallery of the House of Representatives, where he joined Venezuela's opposition leader, a top Border Patrol agent, and several other guests of Mr. Trump. Some health care activists recalled Mr. Limburger's ardent opposition to the Affordable Care Act, while others mentioned Mr. Limburger's attack of Sandra Fluke, a law student whom he mocked in 2012 as a slut and a prostitute after she spoke to a congressional hearing about birth control. Trump's State of the Union speech continues a theme courting black voters. Mr. Trump used the opportunity to plug the Education Freedom Scholarships and Opportunity Act. During his speech, peppered with theatrics, including directing his wife, Melania Trump, to award the Presidential Medal of Freedom to Rush Limburger, the conservative radio talk show host who has advanced lung cancer, Mr. Trump's overtures to black voters were not subtle. During Mr. Trump's speech, some, but not all, members of the Congressional Black Caucus stood and applauded as Mr. Trump rattled off his administration's achievements. In recent days, the White House and the Trump campaign allies have acted bullish on bringing black voters into the fold, including a $25,000 cash giveaway held by a nonprofit organization run by one of Mr. Trump's most prominent African American supporters. Here's a list of everything that went wrong at the Iowa caucus. Some caucus chairs were able to successfully use the app to record and transmit their precinct's results, but problems were common. Many caucus chairs chose to not use the app at all, opting to call in the results to a central hotline instead. Submitting results was more complicated than usual. Chairs were supposed to use the app to transmit results and a photo of their worksheet to party officials, who would calculate the final results. Everyone kept saying politics was broken. Well, the state's top Republicans, including Governor Kim Reynolds, issued a statement Tuesday defending the state's nomination perch, and Mr. Trump said he would protect the tradition as long as he's president. Some moderates immediately argue that the messiness of Iowa has only validated Mr. Bloomberg's bet on bypassing the early stages to focus on contests in March and beyond. Dems right now can't stand in the gymnasium and count how many people move under each side. Senator Ted Cruz, the 2016 winner of the state's Republican caucus, tweeted on Tuesday, "Is 2020 the last year that Iowa will go first?" Troy Price, the head of the Iowa Democratic Party, said at a Tuesday afternoon news conference that it's a conversation that happens every 4 years. Does Iowa deserve to hold the first presidential nomination contest? Gilberto Hinojosa, the Texas Democratic Party chairman, expressed sympathy for Iowa Democratic officials working with an unwieldy new system for reporting results, though he criticized Iowa's head-of-the-line status on other grounds. Reacting overnight to the breakdown of reporting results, Kurt Meyer, the party chairman for Mitchell County in northeast Iowa, said gloomily in a text message, "It's unforgivable, unbelievable, undoubtedly fake to FITN, using the shorthand for first in the nation." Other Democrats in the state and nationally came to Iowa's defense. A longtime member of the party's national committee, Bob Mulholland, a California political activist, said he had received several emails on Tuesday from fellow committee members asking, should Iowa remain first? The 1,600 volunteers who were supposed to make the Iowa caucuses run smoothly. According to more than a dozen Iowa Democratic Party officials, county chairmen, and volunteers involved in running projects, many precinct leaders ignored the party's request that they download the app before the caucus night or found the process of installing it too cumbersome. John Greenan, 44, the Democratic chairman, and Poweshiek County said 7 of the 10 people running precincts in his central Iowa county never downloaded the state party's app to begin with, choosing instead to phone in the results as they always had. We're also busy just trying to get volunteers, Mr. Greenan said. Close out the app and log back in with your PIN. The email read, "The app should save where you were. It does not. Please call your results." Why did Iowa make the caucuses so complicated? Historically, the party has focused on highlighting only one caucus result, the number of delegates each candidate has earned for the state convention. The winner of Iowa caucuses was the person who earned the most state delegates, which translate into national delegates, which determine the nomination. Under the old reporting system, a candidate who received 14% support, just below the threshold for earning delegates, will be indistinguishable from a candidate who received 1% support. Do you know what that means? I have no idea. Buttigieg seizes on an opportunity as Democrats jostle for advantage. Advisors to 3 different campaigns suggested that the final outcome could represent a tepid finish for Mr. Biden based on their own internal data, and his campaign did little to refute that analysis. Mr. Biden's campaign was not the only one to raise questions about the caucus process. Speaking to reporters after midnight, Roger Lau, Ms. Warren's campaign manager, said the interminable delays were damaging the vote. Mr. Bloomberg's campaign manager, Kevin Sheekey, quipped in a television interview that had Iowa Democrats used the financial information technology marketed by Mr. Bloomberg's company, the source of fortune he is now spending on his campaign, they would have assembled the results in a timely fashion. The only safe election is a low-tech election. Because what happened on Monday night, a long and confusing delay in vote counting, due in part to a mobile app that was hastily designed and inadequately tested before being deployed in one of America's most important elections, was an inexcusable failure. Using a proprietary app to report vote totals is a kind of thing that sounds simple on a startup's whiteboard, but utterly falls apart in a chaotic real-world environment where connections drop, phones malfunction, and poorly tested apps strain under surge of traffic. Many of the leading opponents of paperless voting machines were and still are computer scientists because we understand the vulnerability of voting equipment in a way that most election officials don't, said Barbara Simmons, a computer scientist and the board chair of Verified Voting, an election security nonprofit, in an interview with Atlantic in 2017. In Iowa, there is a silver lining. The caucus system doesn't use voting machines at all. The public open-air nature means that it is less susceptible to tampering than a secret ballot. Bloomberg plans to double ad spending after Iowa caucus problems. Michael R. Bloomberg's presidential campaign moved on Tuesday to exploit the chaotic outcome of the Iowa caucuses, escalating an already enormous campaign of television advertising and publicly making the case that a messy outcome in the early states opened the way for Mr. Bloomberg. In an interview on Monday in Compton, California, Mr. Bloomberg was unusually blunt about his campaign spending strategy and his intent to seek advantages while his rivals toiled in the 4 early states, which had relatively few delegates needed to win the nomination. Mr. Sheekey said on Tuesday morning that Mr. Bloomberg had set out to run a national campaign, and that he would double down on that bet as we prepare both a Super Tuesday strategy, but at the same time to stand up against the president in battleground states in November. Besides Iowa, what other states have caucuses? As Iowa grapples with the aftermath of a Democratic caucus that one party leader called a system-wide disaster, American voters and election officials are already looking ahead at a handful of other states and American territories that will be picking or trying to pick the Democratic nominee in similar ways. Why the Iowa caucuses are so important. Protests in the 1960s, a mimeograph machine, and a long-shot candidate all contributed to Iowa's unlikely role in the presidential election process. The desire to capture the big mo from Iowa has only grown thanks in large part to Iowa's embrace of being first and the media storm that descends every 4 years. Beyond the partisan fight, a wealth of evidence about Trump and Ukraine. Mr. Trump connected Mr. Giuliani with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in late March to discuss the allegations. According to an interview with Mr. Giuliani and emails showing at least 2 telephone calls between the men, including one arranged with guidance from Mr. Trump's personal assistant. Mr. Trump's grievances with Ukraine date from his 2016 campaign but were channeled into action by Mr. Giuliani, the former New York City mayor who in April 2018 became part of a legal team defending the president against the special counsel's investigation. Even after Democrats began impeachment proceedings, Mr. Giuliani continued trying to collect information from Ukrainians who he argued would prove that Mr. Trump was justified in calling for Ukraine to investigate the Bidens and Zelensky. Trump and Kushner saw a Super Bowl ad as a way of making inroads with blacks. In a 30-second spot that cost Mr. Trump's campaign millions of dollars, Ms. Johnson's face fills up the screen as she tearfully thanks President John Donald Trump for her early release from prison. Several senior Trump aides expressed skepticism of Mr. Kushner's belief that broad numbers of blacks whose views of the president are overwhelmingly negative are persuadable. Even some of Mr. Trump's most vociferous Republican critics said it was not an off-the-wall idea, although Mr. Trump had only a thin record to run on and a political career marked by racial invective and a proposed Muslim ban to run from. Susan Collins announces she will vote to acquit Trump, calling conduct wrong. Ms. Collins said that Mr. Trump's call to President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, in which he asked for investigation of former Vice President Joseph R. Biden, Jr., was improper and demonstrated very poor judgment, but pointed to conflicting evidence in the record about Mr. Trump's motivations for the improper request. Washington Democrats think President Donald Trump committed high crime and misdemeanor and the moment he defeated Hillary Clinton. Mr. McConnell said, referring to the president's victory in 2016. What is President Trump accused of doing? He's accused of pressuring the app that broke the Iowa caucus. On Monday evening, a precinct captain told me by text that their caucus manager was unable to get the app from the Democratic Party to work and had to do the math to figure out the delegates' longhand. 538's Amelia Thompson DeVoe spoke to a frustrated caucus leader who suggested the app itself wouldn't download. We cannot problem solve getting the app into one of our devices, he told her. Even if the app was working just fine, reports suggest the rollout of the tool was bungled to the point where those tasked with reporting via the app weren't trained to know how to use it. Who exactly is responsible for building the apps intended to protect the integrity of the democratic process? Who is funding the companies behind the tech companies? Who is funding the companies behind the tech companies? Why didn't Iowa Democratic Party disclose the app maker? How are procurement decisions made? Where is the transparency? That is the name of the company at the center of the fiasco, is the literal definition of opacity. Does not help either. Mother Nature scoffs at Trump's Mideast peace plan. Israel used to pump up to 500 million cubic meters of water a year out of the Sea of Galilee, a freshwater lake, to meet the domestic needs, including for agricultural fields in the south of Israel, to turn the desert green. The only guaranteed water for Israel's big urban centers and farms on its coastal plain is desalinated water and treated wastewater, which have chemical issues. Now, in order to adapt to climate change, Israel is having to reverse the direction of its national water transportation system to take desalinated water from its coastal water plants up north to the Sea of Galilee, where, until sustained rainfall this winter began to replenish it, was so diminished it could not serve as Israel's national water tower. After acquittal, it's anything goes for the Republicans. The Senate voted to acquit President Trump on February 5th. On Wednesday, the Senate will most likely vote to acquit President Trump, with the Republicans enthralled to a demagogic leader. Will it accept the results if Mr. Trump loses the election? Will Mr. Trump vacate the White House next January 20th? Or will he claim that the election was a fraud? What is President Trump accused of doing? He's accused blah blah blah. Why you may never learn the truth about ICE. The National Archives made some changes to the plan, but last month it announced that ICE could go ahead and start destroying records from Mr. Trump's first year, including detainees' complaints about civil rights violations and shoddy medical care. Now the State Department is cutting archivists completely out of the process. Instead, it will start using machine learning algorithms to separate the historic from the temporary. Going forward, it is not even planning to turn these records over to National Archives, a clear violation of the Federal Records Act. Mr. Ferriero himself announced that in 2 years, the archives will no longer accept paper records. It simply does not have any more room for them. 4 ways to help your college student grow up. If your student tells you something isn't going well, a roommate who's abusing alcohol or drugs, a less than stellar exam grade, encourage the student to take the first step. Send an email to an advisor on campus, or tap in a telephone reminder to call an appropriate person and set up an appointment. Help them write a script. If your student is scared to talk to a professor or feels intimidated by a dean, help write a script for the occasion. If your student has a tendency to do this, help to reframe the disappointment as a learning opportunity. Your student should follow up with an email or another visit to the professor with specific questions like, what can I do to be better prepared for the next exam? Or if I can't make up this quiz, is there any way for me to try to understand the material and raise my grade? Breakdown in Iowa. Oh, what a night. The Iowa Democratic Party tried something new on Monday night. The privileged status of Iowa's caucuses leading off the presidential campaign season has long been criticized as an unrepresentative of the Democratic electorate. Too rural, too white, too old. People were outraged about the fact the media could not report the outcome of the Iowa caucuses Monday night. COVID tests and the many, many ways we breathe. When the Supreme Court debates the right of employers to refuse coverage of birth control for their employees, one fact cannot be overlooked. Each form of birth control holds powerful health benefits separate and distinct from preventing pregnancy. Some are approved for these non-contraceptive indications by the Food and Drug Administration. The hormonal intrauterine device is first-line therapy for heavy menstrual bleeding, and many brands of birth control pills are approved for the treatment of acne and or premenstrual mood disorders. The health benefits that birth control provides, independent from contraception, are a critical second. That doesn't sound like COVID. Coronavirus in New York. Without Chinese tourists, business sags. With the health officials scrambling to deal with an outbreak that is spreading around the world, tour operators and travel agents in the New York City area are bracing for an economic pain that will come with empty rooms in hotels and empty seats on tour buses. Still, the 1.08 million Chinese who traveled to New York in 2018 represent only 1.6% of the city's 65 million tourists that year, the most recent for which NYC and Company has figures. The vast majority of travelers to New York, some 51.5 million, were Americans from beyond the New York region. Spike in crime inflames debate over bail law in New York. New York City's police commissioner on Tuesday blamed the state's new bail law for the sharp rise in crime last month in serious crimes, warning again that the law allows violent criminals to go free and risks eroding the city's historic improvements in public safety. Mayor Bill de Blasio acknowledged that the city had seen effects emanating from this law for months, suggesting that the impact of the bail law started before January 1st. Supporters of the changes to New York's law said the system had ended up penalizing people who are unable to afford bail, forcing them to rely on expensive bail bonds or remain behind bars with their cases moved through the court. Weinstein trial. Credibility of accuser Jessica Mann attacked. Mr. Weinstein's lawyers relied on his accuser's own words to attempt to discredit her account, painstakingly going over dozens of emails and other electronic communications between the witness, Jessica Mann, and Mr. Weinstein over several years. Donna Rantono, one of Mr. Weinstein's lawyers, asked Ms. Mann about her request in February 2015 that Mr. Weinstein sponsor her for membership in an exclusive club. Mr. Weinstein's lawyers noted that Ms. Mann continued to accept tickets to Oscars and Golden Globe parties for Mr. Weinstein, even asking him if she could bring a friend. Ex-CIA analyst faces trial in biggest leak of agency's history. Their identities are so sensitive that prosecutors told Mr. Schultz's lawyers they could not search for the witnesses on the internet in a way that would link their real names with the CIA. Mr. Schultz faces 11 criminal counts at trial, including stealing classified information from the CIA and lying to the FBI. He has pleaded not guilty in court papers. Mr. Schultz's lawyer, Sabrina Schroff, said that her client did not leak classified information and that other CIA employees who had access to the same computer system as Mr. Schultz Mr. Schultz's lawyer responded in a court filing by saying the culture within Mr. Schultz's CIA group included the frequent use of language that would be considered racist and inappropriate in any other workplace. Coronavirus adds to pressure for U.S. oil industry. It's a blow, said Stephen Pruitt, chief executive of Elevation Resources, a Texas oil company. Especially when you add this to the fact that we're getting almost nothing for our natural gas and oil prices are sliding from $55 a barrel to $50, credit availability is already tight. It's going to get that much tighter. Since China consumes 13 out of every 100 barrels of oil the world produces, every oil company is being hit to some extent. Mr. Sheffield predicted that if oil prices did not go up soon, domestic shale oil production, recently expected to increase by 500,000 to 700,000 barrels a day this year, instead would be flat. Did Fox News edit an interview at Trump's request? Chris Wallace says no. Fox News anchor Chris Wallace spent several hours interviewing Donald J. Trump for an episode of Fox News Sunday. Mr. Wallace spoke with Mr. Trump at Trump Tower in Manhattan, and then flew with Mr. Trump and his advisors to the Army-Navy football game in Baltimore, where the conversation continued. According to Mr. Wallace, he asked Mr. Trump about Mr. Flynn's tweets during the first part of the interview at Trump Tower. Since taking office, Mr. Trump has also insulted Mr. Wallace on Twitter, comparing him unfavorably to his father, the 60 Minutes anchor Mike Wallace. Tesla stock is up 36% in 2 days. What's going on? To the bulls, Tesla is positioned for greatness now that's recovered from a rocky start in 2019. After burning through $1.1 billion in the first half of last year as it struggled with the production and delivery of more affordable Model 3 cars, Tesla turned a corner in the second half of 2019. In a note over the weekend, ARK, an investment management firm, said it expected Tesla's share price to soar to $7,000 in 5 years, based on a belief that Tesla can increase profits, decrease costs, and build a fully autonomous taxi network. The investors borrowed Tesla shares from other brokers and sold them, hoping to buy back their shares and return them once Tesla's stock price declined. Adidas exposed cracks in carmakers' Chinese supply chain. The Hyundai shutdowns, the first factory lines to be idled outside China, could portend more serious disruption in the complex network that supply automakers with essential components and materials. The decision is due to disruption in the supply of parts resulting from a coronavirus outbreak in China. In China, many auto plants have already shut down because of the virus, including factories run by Hyundai, Tesla, Ford, and Nissan. Jeffrey Epstein's mysterious bank came alive after his death. In his application, Mr. Epstein listed as reference James E. Staley, the chief executive of Barclays, who had cultivated a relationship with Mr. Epstein while at J.P. Morgan Chase. Around the time, the territory granted Mr. Epstein his banking license. It also gave a lucrative tax break to Southern Trust, a company Mr. Epstein said was developing sophisticated algorithms to mine DNA and financial databases. The suite seeks to intervene in the administration of Mr. Epstein's will to safeguard assets for dozens of his victims, and claiming the co-executors may have a conflict of interest because they were officers in many of Mr. Epstein's companies, including Southern Country and Southern Trust. Twitter moves to target fake videos and phones. Starting in March, the company said it will add labels or take down tweets to carrying manipulated images and videos. To determine whether a tweet should be removed or labeled, Twitter said in a blog post it would apply several tests, as the media included with a tweet significantly altered or fabricated to mislead. Is it shared in a deceptive manner? In those cases, the tweet will probably get a label, depending on what the tweet sharing the video said, and if it caused harm, Mr. Roth said, Twitter could take the tweet down. Tool to help journalists spot doctored images is unveiled by Jigsaw. 5 of the assembler's image detectors were developed by research teams at universities, including the University of California, Berkeley, the University of Naples, Federico II in Italy, and the University of Maryland. The models can detect things like color pattern anomalies, areas of an image which have been copied and pasted several times over, and whether more than one camera model was used to create an image. Santiago Andrigo, a Jigsaw product manager, said assembler might be most helpful in situations where a journalist from large news organization receives a scandalous image and is under the pressure to break the news. It could also be used to verify an image that has gone viral, he said. Disney Plus racks up 28.6 million subscribers. Disney is expected to report mixed quarterly results on Tuesday, with per-share profit estimated to decline about 20% and revenue climbing by 36%. Initial interest in Disney Plus was bigger than ever Disney anticipated, resulting in login problems. Michael Morris, an analyst at Guggenheim Securities, said in a note last week that the closures would have a significant impact on Disney's sprawling theme park division, which includes outposts in Tokyo, Paris, and Orlando, Florida. Prolonged closures and a slow return of attendance at both Shanghai and Hong Kong for the balance of the year will result in revenue declines of 75%, 50%, and 30% over the next 3 quarters, Mr. Morris said. Top antitrust official is said to recuse himself from Google inquiry. Mekan Delrahim, the head of the antitrust division at the Department of Justice, has recused himself from investigating Google, even as the agency's examination of the largest tech companies ramps up. Last year, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat of Massachusetts, said Mr. Delrahim should recuse himself from tech investigations because of his history of consulting for Google and Amazon and Apple, where he was an attorney last decade, calling his lobbying work for Google and Apple extensive and lucrative. Ms. Warren said in a letter to Ms. Delrahim last June that any reasonable person should surely question your impartiality in antitrust matters involving Google. All-electric movement picks up speed, catching some off guard. Globally, buildings generate nearly 40% of greenhouse gas emissions, but in densely developed American cities, the rate can be substantially higher. In nearby Cambridge, Massachusetts, city officials have already held hearings on an ordinance which would block natural gas connections in new buildings and those being substantially renovated. At any rate, keeping gas out of new building constructions is one thing. Dealing with the 70 million structures already standing in the United States is quite another, said Bruce Nils, a director of the Building Electrification Program at the Rocky Mountain Institute, an energy research organization. And that has been a Read in the Times for Wednesday, February 5th, 2020.